Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
Hi everyone, my name's Owen, and I never thought I'd be in a situation like this. It's going to sound dramatic, but I promise it actually happened. A few weeks ago, my parents celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. My brother, Marcus, and I have always had a complicated relationship with them, but Marcus somehow seems to glide through life untouched by any criticism. He's the perfect son in their eyes, successful, smooth, always ready to take credit for family accomplishments. Me? I've been the difficult one, the one who can't do anything right, according to them. The party was at their house, which is the same massive, pristine place I grew up in but never felt like home. My wife, Clara, and our 5-year-old son, Leo, came with me. Leo had been excited for days about showing his grandparents a drawing he'd made, a superhero family picture with him and us in the center. The moment we arrived, it was clear how the night would go. My parents didn't greet me warmly. They barely glanced at me before turning to Marcus, who had shown up with his fiancée. Mom's eyes lit up like he was the son, and Dad had that familiar smug grin that made my stomach twist. Throughout the evening, they kept making little digs, nothing overt, but enough to make you notice. Mom kept talking about how proud she was of Marcus for carrying the family name in his business, while Dad would casually drop comments about how Marcus understood what it meant to be successful. I smiled politely, nodding, but it was exhausting. I kept Leo close, because I knew what would happen if he tried to show them his drawing. Of course, at one point, Leo tugged at my sleeve. "Daddy, can I give them my drawing?" I hesitated. I could see it coming. But he was 5, and he was proud. I knelt down, whispering, "Okay, let's try it." Leo marched over to my parents, holding his paper out with both hands. Dad looked down at him, and the smile that should have been warm twisted into a snort. "You should learn from the real grandkids," he said, not even looking at the drawing. Mom chuckled, shaking her head like he had just said something clever. Leo's little shoulders slumped. He looked up at me with wide eyes, confused and hurt. Without a word, I took his hand and walked out. The party faded behind us. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the endless praise for Marcus. I didn't say a word the entire drive home. Leo stayed quiet too, hugging his drawing to his chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The way my parents treated Leo, my own son, who idolized them, was unbearable. It wasn't the first time they had favored Marcus over me, but seeing it affect my kid, so purely and innocently, lit something in me. I work in finance, and part of my job gives me access to certain family accounts. Not all of them, but enough to know what was going on behind the scenes. I opened the system. I double-checked everything. Every account linked to my parents, every business holding, every transfer, every detail that could quietly put them at a disadvantage if handled correctly. I didn't do anything yet, just looked. The numbers were staggering. They had been careless with some investments, overconfident in others, and Marcus had been benefiting quietly from some transfers that should have been split evenly. I leaned back, my mind racing. The thought of just letting them keep treating Leo and me like this, while Marcus continued to be the golden son, was unbearable. And then I realized, I could make them feel what it's like to be powerless. But if I did, I'd be the villain in everyone's eyes, the selfish, vengeful son. The next morning, I took a deep breath and made a few strategic moves in the system. By 10 a.m., every account they had access to was frozen. Not permanently, but enough that every transaction, every scheduled payment, everything, halted. I thought it would be enough to make them panic, to make them understand. But the messages started immediately. Marcus called first, angry and confused. Mom followed, her voice trembling, not with concern, but with outrage at me. Dad didn't even call. He texted a single line. "You've crossed a line, Owen. We'll see how far you go." I didn't respond. Not yet. I just watched the chaos unfold. That's when I realized how deep this was going to go. This wasn't just about money or favoritism anymore. This was about control, pride, and finally proving a point they had spent decades denying me. I could feel it coming, the full force of their wrath. And I knew they'd stop at nothing to make me the bad guy. But that night, when I tucked Leo into bed, He looked up at me and said something that made every bit of fear disappear. "Daddy, we didn't need them to like my drawing. We know it's good." The next morning, the house was quiet in a way that felt heavier than any argument I'd ever had with my parents. Clara left early for work, leaving me with Leo, and I used the time to think through what I'd done. I wasn't reckless. I had made sure everything could be undone if I wanted, but I also knew the moment I hit freeze on their accounts, there was no turning back. By mid-morning, the first signs of chaos began. I could hear the sharp ping of incoming emails and text messages. My phone buzzed constantly, and I tried to ignore it while making breakfast for Leo. But the messages kept coming, each one a little more frantic, a little more desperate. "Why are our accounts frozen?" Mom's email read. Polite, but underneath it, I could feel her panic. "We need access immediately. Contact your IT department. This is unacceptable." Dad's message was short and cold. Marcus, surprisingly, was the one who called. His voice was strained, almost panicked. "Owen, what did you do?" he asked, his tone walking the line between disbelief and fury. "We can't access anything. Mom and Dad are freaking out." "I just froze the accounts," I said calmly. "Nothing permanent. They can be restored. But I wanted to see if anyone noticed how much control you all assume over things that aren't yours." There was silence on the line. Then a sharp inhale from Marcus. You can't do that. You're not supposed to have access to this." "I do," I replied. "And now you're all seeing the consequences of being careless, of acting like some people are worth more than others." He hung up before I could respond. By noon, the full weight of the situation hit. Mom stormed over, unannounced, in a black dress she probably wore to intimidate rather than for comfort. She didn't even knock. She came in, flustered and fuming, carrying her purse like it was a weapon. "Owen," she said, her voice high and sharp, "this is unacceptable. How could you do something like this? You're making our lives impossible." I stayed seated at the kitchen table, Leo building a small tower of blocks on the floor beside me. I met her gaze calmly. "You've been impossible for years," I said quietly. "Favoring Marcus, dismissing me, mocking my choices, and now my son. You need to understand that actions have consequences." Mom's eyes narrowed. She took a step closer, as if proximity alone could intimidate me. "This isn't about favoritism. You're twisting everything. You're being dramatic. This is why you've never fit in, Owen. You always make a mountain out of a molehill." I shook my head. "This isn't a molehill. This is years of watching you treat people, especially my son, like they're less than, like they're not part of the family." Her face turned red, and she waved her hands, frantic. "Leo is fine. He's a child. He doesn't understand anything. You're overreacting, and you're hurting your father." I stopped her mid-sentence. "Leo understood. He understands kindness, and he understands respect. And you clearly don't." She faltered, unsure of what to say next. I could see her trying to calculate a new attack, but the words wouldn't come. She backed away, muttering about contacting lawyers and accountants. Then Dad called. He hadn't come himself yet. He probably assumed I'd be easier to scare over the phone. But his voice carried that same cold authority I remembered from childhood, the kind that made everyone else in the room tense. "Owen," he said, slow and deliberate, "you've crossed a line. I don't care if you think this is about Leo, or you, or anything else. You've interfered with family property, and there will be consequences." "I'm aware," I said, "and I'm also aware of how you've treated me and Leo. Maybe now you're seeing how it feels." He laughed, low, hollow, and unnerving. "You think you're teaching us a lesson? You think freezing accounts proves anything? You're making yourself the villain in this story, Owen. You know that, right?" "Yes," I admitted. "I know that, and I'm okay with it, because the real villainy has always been yours." There was a long pause. Then he snapped, "This isn't over." By late afternoon, my phone was buzzing with messages from extended family. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people who barely knew the situation, were sending texts asking if everything was okay, some praising my parents for their calmness and insinuating I'd gone too far. The narrative was already starting to spin against me. Leo, oblivious to the storm, came over and handed me a new drawing he had made. "For us," he said. "Just us." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't in years. Thank you, buddy. It's perfect. But the warmth didn't last long. By evening, Dad had arrived at the house. He didn't come alone. Marcus was with him, along with Mom in tow. They walked in as if this was a casual visit, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Marcus held a folder in his hand, likely financial statements or some kind of evidence they thought would scare me. Dad's gaze swept the room, landing on Leo. For a moment, I thought he might try to act charming, but the scowl came back almost immediately. "Sit down, Owen," he said, his voice even but sharp. "We're going to talk about what you've done, and you're going to fix it. Now." I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I watched him step closer, trying to dominate the space, while Marcus leaned over slightly, as if to whisper instructions. Mom lingered behind, her face tense, as if she was ready to swoop in at the first sign of weakness. Leo stood behind me, holding my leg with both hands. I felt a surge of protective anger. They weren't just coming after me. They were coming after him, trying to intimidate him too. Dad's eyes narrowed. "You're being defiant, Owen. That's fine. But this ends tonight. I don't care if you think you're in the right. You're going to pay for this." I could feel the adrenaline rise. I realized something then. This was no longer just about frozen accounts or favoritism. This was a full-blown power struggle, and I had just stepped into a storm that had been brewing for decades. They wanted me to be the villain, to crumble under pressure, but I wasn't going to. And in that moment, I understood that this confrontation wasn't going to end quietly. I could see it in their eyes. Dad was calculating. Mom was furious. Marcus was smug but nervous. Every single one of them believed they were untouchable, that family loyalty shielded them from consequences. But they hadn't counted on me. I tightened my grip on Leo's hand, feeling the determination settle in me like armor. Whatever came next, I was ready. And that's when Dad's expression changed, a flicker of unease, maybe the first real crack in his composure. He said something that made me pause, that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Owen, do you have any idea what you're about to unleash?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, my jaw set, my hand still holding Leo's. Because I did. Dad's words hung in the room like a dark cloud. "Do you have any idea what you're about to unleash?" he repeated, slower this time, as if trying to scare me into submission. I glanced at Leo, who was watching me with wide, trusting eyes, and felt a surge of protective certainty. Whatever storm was coming, it wasn't going to touch him while I was here. "I think I do," I said quietly, my voice steady. "And I've already seen enough to know that what's coming is long overdue." Mom, behind him, scoffed. "Long overdue? You think freezing a few accounts is justice? This is childish, Owen. You're making a spectacle out of yourself." I shook my head. "Childish? No. Necessary? Absolutely. You've spent decades manipulating, favoring, and dismissing everyone who wasn't Marcus. That ends tonight." Marcus stepped forward, waving the folder he had been clutching. "Owen, we can fix this. You don't have to make things worse. Just unfreeze the accounts. Let's handle this like adults." I stared at him. The arrogance in his face, the smug confidence, the way he always expected to be praised, it was infuriating. He had no idea what I'd already discovered, how much control I held, and how carefully I had planned the smallest details. "You think this is about the accounts?" I asked. "This is about respect. This is about my son seeing that he isn't less than anyone because of who his grandparents favor. You've been teaching him the wrong lesson his whole life." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Owen, you're treading on dangerous ground. You think you have the moral high ground, but this isn't about morals. It's about property, family, and consequences. You're making enemies where none need exist." "I've been an enemy in your eyes for 35 years, I said. "So if being the villain means protecting my son from the same cruelty you've inflicted on me, I'll wear the title proudly." There was a tense silence. Dad's face twitched slightly. Mom's jaw was tight. Marcus looked uncertain for the first time, as if realizing that maybe he hadn't been entirely untouchable. Then Mom spoke, her voice a low hiss. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're risking everything. The family reputation, the business, everything. You'll regret this." I looked at her steadily. "Regret is yours, not mine. You and Dad have spent decades teaching Marcus and punishing me. You've mocked my choices, belittled my achievements, and humiliated my son. Tonight, you're learning what it feels like to be powerless." Marcus opened his mouth, but I held up my hand, stopping him. "No, Marcus, this isn't for you. This is for me and Leo. And if you want to stay in this room without becoming part of the problem, you'll watch and learn." Dad's lips pressed into a thin line. His usual calm, calculating demeanor was beginning to crack. He took a slow step closer, towering over me in the living room, but I didn't flinch. I could feel Leo's small hand gripping mine tightly, and it gave me a strange kind of courage, knowing I wasn't alone in this. "You're making a mistake," Dad said, his tone lower now, almost a warning. "A very expensive, very public mistake. And when this comes out, everyone will know exactly what you did." I shrugged lightly. "Maybe, but I've lived in the shadow of Marcus and your approval for years. I've been the one ignored, the one humiliated, the one made to feel small. And now, for the first time, I'm in control of the narrative." Dad's jaw tightened, and he turned his gaze to Marcus. "Did you know he had access to this?" he asked sharply. Marcus shook his head, suddenly looking smaller than usual. I didn't, Dad. I swear. I had no idea." That flicker of panic was the first real crack in the family armor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let me see that they weren't invincible. I realized I wasn't just fighting them. I was unraveling a carefully constructed hierarchy they'd spent decades building, and every step I took made them more desperate. Mom's voice broke through, sharp and frantic. "Owen, you need to undo this. This is reckless. Do you know how many people are going to be affected if this continues?" "I know," I said calmly. "And that's exactly why I did it. You've built your lives on the idea that you can manipulate everyone without consequences. Maybe now you'll understand what that feels like." Dad leaned closer, his face almost inches from mine. "You're not just risking money. You're risking our entire family. Your reputation. Your career. And for what? A child's drawing?" I looked down at Leo. He had quietly started coloring in a new drawing at the corner of the room, completely unfazed by the adults shouting around him. The sight of him, innocent and absorbed in something pure, reminded me why I'd done this. "For much more than a drawing," I said quietly. "For him. For all the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and humiliated. For the first time in my life, I'm standing up, and I'm not going to back down." Dad's lips pressed into a hard line. He straightened, taking a deliberate step back, his eyes never leaving mine. Mom crossed her arms, muttering under her breath, the kind of calculation that meant she was planning the next move. Marcus shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure what to do next, and for once, I could see he wasn't in control. Then, in a sudden, chilling moment, Dad's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I caught a flash of something I hadn't expected: fear. Not fear like panic, but the kind that comes when you realize the rug has been pulled out from under you. He swallowed hard. "Owen," he said, voice tighter now, "you don't know what you're dealing with." "I do," I said, my jaw set. "And I'm ready for it." At that moment, the air in the room seemed to shift. The tension was electric, as if the calm before a storm had turned into the first strike of lightning. Every one of them, the parents, Marcus, was calculating, waiting for the other to make a move, and I could feel the weight of what I'd done pressing down on all of us. Leo looked up at me, his little hand still in mine, completely unaware of the family tension but trusting me completely. And I knew, at that moment, that nothing they could throw at me mattered, not if it came at the cost of protecting him. Dad's eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. "This isn't over," he said again, but this time there was a quiet edge of unease in his voice. Something had shifted. I leaned back slightly, still holding Leo's hand. "No," I said softly. "It's just beginning. I learned a long time ago that revenge doesn't look like the movies. It's not a single, glorious moment. It's a slow pressure applied in the right places until whatever's rotten inside gives." After that first night, the freezes, the phone calls, the stares, the thing I wanted most was not to make noise. It was to be surgical. Clara was my anchor. She didn't cheer when I told her what I'd done. She didn't condemn me either. She listened. That evening, After my parents left in a haze of threats and whispered phone calls, she made tea and sat across from me at the kitchen table while Leo fell asleep upstairs. "You know this will destroy them," she said quietly. "We have to be sure this is the hill we want to die on." "We're not dying," I replied. "We're finally being seen." I told her everything I'd already found: misdirected transfers, a couple of invoices with Marcus's company as the beneficiary, obscure shell entities that had received payments from family trusts. I told her I had traced patterns back 3 years and that the numbers, while not illegal on their face, pointed to systematic favoritism that had enriched Marcus at everyone else's expense. I told her I wasn't satisfied with moral victory. I wanted the truth to matter in a way they couldn't smother with charm. Clara touched my hand and said the thing I needed to hear: "Then do it smartly. Don't let them paint you as the crazy son." She made me promise to document everything, to be methodical, to make sure if they screamed betrayal, the facts would hum like a knife. I spent the next 48 hours like a man painting the underside of a bridge, slow, careful, wearing gloves. I exported copies of transaction logs and cross-referenced dates with family events, birthdays, and business filings. I pulled internal emails that referenced family allocations. I archived everything in several formats and encrypted copies to lockboxes that would be impossible to tamper with. I printed a select set, the clearest, ugliest threads that showed money moving from trusts and accounts into places that lined Marcus's pockets. The next step was about leverage, not violence. I reached out to someone I trusted, a compliance officer I'd worked with years ago on a different system who had no ties to my family. His name was Raphael. He loved orderly things and hated corruption. I didn't tell him who I was related to at first. I framed the call as a hypothetical. What happens if a network of accounts linked to a family trust shows unusual transfers to a private company? He walked me through reporting channels, regulatory expectations, and the kind of documentation that would trigger an investigation. When I finally sent him the files and told him the names, his voice went very calm. "If you want this to hold up, we have to be clean. No leaks. No theatrics." That suited me. I could feel the shape of the plan forming. I would not attack them publicly. I would force institutions to look. Banks are risk-averse. Auditors are more afraid of consequences than people are of shame. If the right gatekeepers asked the right questions, the family's network would unravel without a single angry social media post from me. But I couldn't just sit and wait while they mobilized. Within days, their behavior became desperate in ways that told me more than their words ever could. Dad hired a private attorney who specialized in family disputes and asset protection. Mom began calling distant relatives, stitching together a narrative of a hurt son gone rogue. Marcus floated the idea of a smear campaign, quietly whispering that I'd acted out of spite. I was no stranger to being gaslit, but this time I had documents and timestamps and bank reference numbers. They tried intimidation first. My father called late one night, his usual measured voice threaded with a brittle edge. "You think you've won something, Owen? You think disabling accounts is the same as changing respect? You'll find out how dangerous it is to make your family enemies." I had the impulse to slam the phone down, to let him hear the anger in me, but instead I said, "If you have business concerns, take them to the bank's legal department. If you have accusations, make them formal. I have nothing to hide." Marcus came with a softer hand, but the same aim. He texted me a photo of a charity gala where his company had been the sponsor, with a caption about legacy and stewardship. It was performative, and I saved it. I saved everything. The first true break came when an outside auditor, prompted by Raphael's anonymous tip and the frozen accounts, sent a notice to the family's trust administrators requesting documentation for several transactions labeled family support that lacked sufficient paperwork. In legalese, routine review. To everyone else, it was a letter. To my parents, it read like an alarm. Their reaction was predictably theatrical. They called the bank manager, the family lawyer, and a family friend who owed their household favors. They demanded answers and threatened litigation. They threw their weight around in a panic. Underneath the rage, though, I could hear the real sound: fear, because the auditor asked questions that couldn't be answered with charm. When I arrived at their house 2 evenings later, I told Clara I was going to talk, to see if we could end this quietly. I wanted to look calm in front of Leo. I wanted the hard line between us to soften if possible. Dad ushered me into the study like he had when I was a kid, the room smelling faintly of old leather and aftershave, the curtains drawn to keep things private. Marcus hovered near the doorway. Mom stood with a phone in her hand, her face pale. They did the theatrics, righteous hurt, indignant accusations. But then the bank representative they'd flown in for damage control arrived with a thin legal folder. He sat down, placed the folder on the desk, and for the first time I heard words I hadn't expected. There are a set of flagged transactions. The auditor is requesting a fuller accounting. Until we clear this, several disbursements will remain on hold. Dad's face fell. The careful composure I'd known all my life trembled for an instant. I watched him, that fortress of propriety, shiver. Marcus tried to smile, an attempt at control that looked fragile. They'd managed to leverage all their social capital, but the bank's compliance department had standards they couldn't charm away. For days afterward, it was worse. The family started to fracture along lines I'd long suspected existed. A cousin who'd always turned to Dad for favors texted to say he felt uncomfortable about recent transfers. An old friend who'd co-signed a loan for Marcus asked for a meeting. Small fissures widened into conspicuous absences from family gatherings. Reputation is a delicate commodity. Once investors sense instability, they move fast. Then a new, nastier effort emerged, public pressure. Someone, likely Dad's attorney, whispered to a local columnist about a troubled son targeting his parents' finances. The column was careful, but the insinuation was there. People sent me messages of concern and a few veiled threats. For me, the public smear was expected. I'd banked on it. I'd secured copies of everything and locked them behind people whose job was to follow paper trails, not gossip. If they wanted to paint me as a villain, fine. I knew what truth felt like and what words could hold it together. And then Marcus made a mistake. He misfiled an invoice. In his rush to regain control, to project competence, he signed an expense report that matched one of the shell entities I had already documented. It was sloppy, childishly so, and when the auditors cross-checked, it lit up the ledger like a flare. Within 48 hours, there were more formal inquiries. The language changed from request for documentation to potential irregularities. I watched Marcus at the next family meeting, the one Dad had called in a panic and tried to stage like damage control. He was hollowed out, saying the words he thought would fix things without understanding why they sounded hollow. He kept glancing at me, searching for rage or weakness or some reaction to bait him into an argument he could win in front of others. I gave him none. I sat there with my hands folded, and when everyone turned to me expecting contrition, I handed over a printed bundle of documents for them to see. No theatrics, no flourish, just evidence, arranged chronologically, with clear annotations. Mom's face collapsed in stages. First confusion, then denial, then the specific kind of disbelief that comes when all your defenses fail. Dad's color went ashen. Marcus, who'd always been able to smile through storms, looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ocean beneath him was not a solid surface. "You handed this to them?" Dad hissed after everyone left, his voice lower now, edged with something like awe and fear. "You didn't show them to an attorney first?" "I did what I had to," I said. "If you'd had any intention of addressing this properly, you'd have done so without forcing me to. The audits will proceed on their schedule." He pinched the bridge of his nose, an old, exhausted gesture. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I saw something I hadn't expected. A man who'd built his life on being untouchable, finally aware he'd miscalculated. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was exhaustion, like the end of a very long climb that might still have a dangerous descent. The next morning, when a plain envelope from the auditing firm arrived at my parents' mailbox, marked confidential and stamped with a date for an in-person review, I knew the next stage had begun. This was no longer private. It was procedural. It had the weight of institutions behind it. And that's when the other shoe dropped. Marcus texted his fiancée a message that, by mistake, included the name of a ledger entry linked to an offshore consultancy. She, in turn, forwarded it to a friend who worked for a financial podcast. Within hours, the story, carefully worded but with enough teeth to make people listen, started pinging through channels I had not intended to touch. I hadn't wanted immediate public attention, and yet it arrived unbidden. I felt a strange tension in my chest, vindication mixed with dread. This is the cost of starting something that moves beyond your control. The institutions would do as institutions do. They'd follow trails and subpoena accounts and interview trustees. They'd not care about the niceties of family loyalty. That afternoon, Dad arrived at our house. He didn't come with the old bluster. He came with a manila folder and a face that had been hollowed by the last 24 hours. "We can fix this," he said softly, as if the softness might cough up the truth. "We can handle it. We can quiet the noise." Clara watched him from the hallway, arms folded, while Leo colored at the table. "We can," I said slowly, thinking of Raphael, the auditor, the freezing orders, Marcus's sloppy filings, and the podcaster's message that had already started a small ripple on social media. "Or we can let the institutions do their work." Dad's eyes flicked to Leo. For the first time in my adult life, I felt the power of choosing not to forgive on someone else's behalf, and it steadied me. He realized the risk had become real. He realized we were no longer just siblings squabbling. We'd pulled a thread on a sweater knit through years of complicity. As he stood in our kitchen, looking smaller than any man had a right to, a text vibrated on his phone. He read it, and his face changed. Not panic this time, but calculation, immediate and desperate. "They want to interview Marcus next week," he said. "If they find anything." If they find anything, I finished for him. "It won't be because of me. It will be because the books were wrong." He swallowed. "This will make headlines," he said. "Maybe," I answered. "And maybe the headlines will finally say what's been whispered in the dark for years." He left not with the stinging threats he'd always used, but with a hollow, rehearsed politeness that had lost its teeth. After he closed the door, Clara and I sat at the kitchen table in a quiet that felt like a line drawn. Leo's crayons rolled softly against the paper. It was then my phone lit up with a message I'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. An official summons from the auditing firm marking a date for a comprehensive review at my parents' attorney's office. The line read, "Please attend. Investigator will be present." I stared at the words until they blurred. The next steps, legal filings, interviews, subpoenas, would bring everything into a light I hadn't given them the first time around. The thing I'd started had teeth, and it was hungry. I put the phone down, walked upstairs, and found Leo asleep with his drawing tucked under his chin. My heart clenched at the sight. Protecting him had been the simple, honest reason I'd acted. Now the stakes were real in a way even I hadn't fully faced. There are moments when you reach for a lever and realize the machine you've turned on will not stop at the part you intended. I knew more battles lay ahead, allies to secure, lawyers to convince, a public narrative to manage. I also knew this. No matter how they tried to cast me, I would not withdraw the evidence. Whatever else happened, the truth had been set in motion. That night, I made a list. Names of people who could corroborate transactions, dates, copies of emails. A plan to make sure Leo's life continued as normally as possible. I went to bed with my hands clasped around the small, sharp fact that I had chosen the path and could not unchoose it. The next morning, before the meeting, a knock came at our door. When I opened it, there stood Raphael, calm, composed, with a folder under his arm and an expression that suggested we were crossing into a different territory entirely. "We need to talk," he said, "because this is bigger than you, Owen. If you want this to finish cleanly, you'll have to be ready for what they'll do next." I stepped aside and let him in. As he sat down at our kitchen table, Leo playing at his feet, I realized the thing I'd set in motion had allies now, and enemies in suits and polite voices. I felt both terrified and oddly feral, like a man who'd lit a controlled burn and was now watching the wind pick up. Raphael opened his folder and laid out his first question. "When we go complete, do you have evidence to show intent or only transactions?" My answer would decide whether this was a compliance matter that ended with sanctions or a scandal that would splinter the family forever. I looked at him, at Clara, at sleeping Leo, and then pushed the folder of documents toward the center of the table. We have both, I said, and we will go complete. Raphael's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Then buckle up, he said. Because when institutions move, they don't apologize for collateral damage. Outside, the day hummed with normal life. Cars, distant lawnmowers, mailboxes clattering. Inside, the quiet creaked with the weight of decisions. I thought of my father's snort at Leo's drawing. I thought of Marcus's smirk. I thought of the way my mother had laughed them into existence. We ate breakfast in silence, and when the time came to leave for the meeting, I picked up Leo, tucked him under my arm, and walked into the day with a folder in my hand and a certainty in my chest I had never had before. We were no longer in the arena of insults and polite ostracizing. We had moved the fight where rules mattered. The family's next move would tell me whether they would try to rebuild the world around them or defend it by any means necessary. When we stepped out the door, the first text arrived on my phone. From an unknown number, 3 words that made my skin go cold. We know where you work. I looked down at Leo, sleeping against my shoulder, and felt the room tilt. The air seemed to thicken with a threat that was no longer just personal. They were coming for more than reputation. They were starting to aim where I could be hurt. I tightened my grip on the stroller handle and felt, for the first time in months, the true weight of the things I'd set in motion. The plan had worked, up to a point. Now the next chapter was no longer mine to write alone. The investigator's office waited 2 blocks away. The next move would change everything. I wish I could tell you there was a single, cinematic moment when everything snapped into place and the story neatly resolved itself. It didn't. What followed was weeks, then months, of small, surgical movements that collectively became a reckoning. It was slow. It was ugly. It was, at times, quieter than I expected, and at other times louder than either of us could bear. But in the end, the things my parents had built on whispers and favors and tilted books came apart, and the people who had used kindness as a costume were left exposed. The meeting with the investigator was the first public step. Raphael came with me. He didn't need to, but he wanted to make sure the conversation stayed on the rails. The investigator, neutral, precise, and a little bored, asked methodical questions: dates, transfers, beneficiaries, emails. I answered honestly, and I handed over the files I curated. I expected the room to hum with tension, and it did, but not the theatrical kind. It was the focused hum of someone following an accurate trail. When the investigator asked why I froze the accounts before reporting, I did not try to hide the truth. I explained my motive: a father's anger at his son's humiliation. I explained the precautions, how nothing was deleted, how everything was time-stamped and backed up. I told him I'd contacted Raphael and that Raphael had advised a procedural approach. I spoke calmly about the patterns I'd found and the way money had moved through family-held trusts into private entities tied to Marcus's companies. I did not ask for mercy. I did, however, make sure the facts were available to the people who could do something with them. From that point, the machinery moved. Banks opened formal investigations. Trust administrators were put on notice. The auditing firm scheduled a series of interviews and demanded full ledgers. Marcus's company was put under review by a business partner who was outrageously attentive to reputation. They demanded explanations and temporary freezes on certain contracts to reduce their risk. The local regulatory body issued a preliminary notice of inquiry. It all sounds dry when you write it like that, but each notice felt like a drumbeat, a steady, inexorable rhythm toward accountability. There were plenty of moments when I wondered if I'd done the right thing. Voices rose against me from unexpected corners. A local columnist, a friend of my parents', wrote a piece painting me as the prodigal son gone rogue, a man who weaponized his access to family finances for petty revenge. It stung. The world prefers neat narratives: villain or victim, black or white. Mine was messy. I'd become, in many people's eyes, the villain. That public narrative was ugly, and it lasted long enough to make me question whether exposing the truth had been worth the social cost. But the ledger doesn't care about narratives. Numbers do not lie if you follow them patiently. The auditors traced payments that had been labeled ambiguously family support, consulting, miscellaneous, and followed them to a consultancy set up offshore that suddenly showed up as a regular recipient of funds. Contracts showed advisory fees for services that could not be substantiated. Correspondence revealed that some invoices were created after funds had already been moved. Those threads, tied together, formed a picture that was hard to argue away. Marcus tried to salvage things. He hired lawyers, made statements about clerical errors, and publicly expressed shock that anyone would question the family's integrity. He insisted he'd never knowingly accepted anything untoward. But there are levels of negligence that become culpability when they're consistent, and his was a pattern. The business partners demanded audits, and some withdrew support to minimize their own exposure. Contracts were delayed, then canceled. The company's reputation bled, and with reputation gone, opportunities shrank. My parents, my mother in particular, began to fragment in a way that cut through the public polish. Mom's calls for calm turned to frantic whisperings to mutual friends, then to tearful conversations with relatives who had previously depended on her for favors. Dad, who had always used his posture and his voice as shields, became smaller in public. In private, the indignation remained, but it mixed now with a real, visible fear. They tried to shore themselves up with lawyers and quiet settlements, but trust administrators had already seen enough to demand structural changes. Trustees swapped, oversight increased, and for the first time in decades, family money was no longer entirely at their unilateral disposal. The auditor's final report arrived like a verdict in a small town. It was careful in language, but unambiguous in effect. Multiple transactions lacked sufficient documentation. A set of transfers disproportionately benefited private entities connected to Marcus. Some disbursements were outside the family's stated charitable or support objectives. The report recommended further regulatory review and referred a few matters to enforcement for potential civil penalties. It did not, crucially, exonerate anyone. It did not paint me as the villain the tabloids wanted to name. It simply placed the facts where they belonged, in the hands of institutions whose job is to enforce standards. There were legal consequences. Marcus was fined by a partner organization for failing to disclose related party transactions and faced demands for reimbursement from the trust for what the trustees determined were improper disbursements. A few contracts that sustained his business were terminated. Other potential clients balked at the risk. Some remote entities linked to his ventures were dissolved. My parents were forced to accept increased oversight in exchange for unfreezing accounts necessary for basic living expenses. They were no longer omnipotent within the web of their finances. Did anyone go to prison? No. The threshold for criminal fraud is high and requires evidence of intent to defraud beyond reasonable doubt. The enforcement agencies recommended civil remedies and tighter compliance, and a handful of restitution orders followed. Marcus faced the brunt of the professional consequences. He lost business, he lost trust, and he lost a reputation he had built on charm. My parents lost authority, and with it, many of their social privileges. They kept their dignity in a legal sense, but the veneer that had protected them in polite circles cracked and would never fully reseal. As for me, there were repercussions too. I was investigated by my employer for unauthorized access to systems. I confessed. I admitted I had used my credentials to pull family records. It could have been career-ending, but Raphael's involvement and the procedural steps I had taken to preserve evidence and report to neutral institutions changed the tone of the inquiry. My employer concluded that while I had violated policy, my motivations were to expose wrongdoing and protect a vulnerable party, my son, and they opted for a disciplinary outcome short of termination, a suspension and a requirement to move into a role with more oversight and transparency. They made it clear that my access would be curtailed. I accepted the terms. I had been willing to trade my career to protect Leo, and in the end, I kept it with conditions I could live with. Publicly, people continued to whisper. Some friends pulled away. Some relatives stopped returning calls. The narrative of the angry son who froze accounts stuck in people's minds like a half-remembered rumor. But quietly, things shifted. Those who mattered, the auditors, the trustees, responsible business partners, saw the documentation and the timeline and adjusted their actions accordingly. What had started as a personal act of hurt turned into an institutional process that corrected, or at least constrained, the misuse of family wealth. The family fractured in places I'd been certain they never would. Cousins who had stood in the wings took sides. Some sided with my parents out of habit and obligation. Others, who had been on the receiving end of the same favoritism I had, finally felt seen and spoke up. Family dinners stopped. Invitations to weddings and graduations went unextended or were quietly rescinded. In time, Marcus's engagement was postponed. His company shrank. My parents retreated into a smaller social circle that included people willing to overlook the audit's conclusions. They were villains in the eyes of those they had wronged, and in the court of public opinion, they carried the stain of impropriety. Leo watched much of this from a distance. I shielded him from the worst of it. I could not undo the humiliation he'd felt the night he offered his drawing and my father snorted, but I could make sure he never learned that to be kind was to be weak. He saw me stand up, and that mattered. We moved, just a few neighborhoods over, into a quieter house that felt like a place we could rebuild. I changed roles at work. We tightened our circle to people who treated honesty like a value, not a spectacle. When it was all said and done, what happened was this. The auditor's report curbed the family's ability to move funds without oversight. Marcus's business suffered real, material losses and had to restructure. My parents lost the unfettered control they'd once enjoyed and, with it, many of their privileges. They were not criminally charged, but they were publicly and institutionally constrained. They tried to brand me as the villain, and for a while, that stuck in gossip columns and on the tongues of neighbors. But institutions had addressed the ledger. Contracts were rescinded, restitution was ordered, trustees were changed. The private world my parents had used to protect their privileges was no longer private. I did not forgive them. Forgiveness felt like forgetting, and I could not pretend the small, intentional cruelties had been accidents. They had been choices. They had taught my son to expect ridicule from those who were supposed to love him. I chose to act because I would not hand him a life with that lesson stitched into it. The family did not reconcile. There were no grand reunions, no tearful apologies. Instead, there were quiet, irrevocable shifts, phone calls that stopped, invitations that were no longer extended, and a community that no longer bowed to their polish. As for me, I paid a price, professionally and socially, but I kept what mattered most. I kept my integrity. I kept my son. I kept a life where he goes to bed knowing someone will protect him, not excuse him. Marcus lost his business momentum and learned, painfully, that charm does not replace accountability. My parents lost their unchallenged authority and the comfortable narrative they'd used to excuse themselves. They grew smaller in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen. The final scene is simple. A year after the freezes, Leo is 5 years older in spirit than his age suggests, still drawing little heroes, but now adding a small figure with his hand outstretched. Always the defender in the picture. We live in a house that is not perfect, but is ours. I go to sleep some nights with the weight of the public whispers still on my chest, and some mornings with relief that the ledger no longer bends reality to someone else's story. They are, in the end, villains, their choices revealed, their privileges curtailed, their social circle narrowed to those who are willing to defend them despite the facts. I did not seek to utterly destroy them. I sought to stop them from teaching my son cruelty and to make sure the institutions that should have been watching in the first place did their job. That job was done. If you ask me if I regret it, the honest answer is no. The cost was high and the path lonely, but when Leo draws a picture and offers it with both hands, I no longer have to hold my breath. He knows, with the simple certainty of a child, that his drawing matters. And sometimes that is everything. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. My name is Harrison, and I'm 26. Something happened last weekend at a family dinner that I can't stop replaying in my head. Honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it because I never thought my own family could act so cruelly entitled. So, my parents invited me over on Saturday evening to celebrate my older brother, Simon's, promotion. Simon's always been the golden child, the one my parents treat like he's flawless, while I somehow got stuck being the quiet, practical one who needs to learn his place, according to my mom. The thing is, Simon works in finance and gets tons of attention for it, while I run a small but growing business. I've never needed my parents' approval, but for some reason, I still accepted the invitation. Maybe I wanted to see if they'd at least pretend to be proud of me. I arrived around 7 p.m., and the house looked immaculate, the way it always does when they're trying to impress someone. My mom greeted me with that fake smile she uses when she knows she's about to deliver some lecture disguised as a compliment. My dad was in the living room, scrolling on his phone, occasionally giving me a distracted nod. Simon came over with that smug grin he always wears, clearly pleased that he was the center of attention. Dinner started off normal enough. Polite chatter, my dad bragging a little about Simon's work, my mom subtly reminding everyone that Simon's achievements were due to her excellent guidance. I stayed quiet mostly, sipping my water, watching everyone inflate Simon's ego. Then, halfway through the main course, my mom dropped a bomb. "Harrison," she said, and of course, all eyes turned to me. "Since Simon's promotion means he needs a bigger space to work from home, we've decided it's time for you to move out of your room." I froze mid-bite. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she said, with that annoying calm that somehow makes her cruelty worse. "You're moving out so Simon can have your room. It's only fair. You know how hard he's worked." Everyone laughed. Simon clapped slowly, mockingly, like this was the funniest thing he'd ever witnessed. My dad chuckled, shaking his head, and my mom patted Simon on the shoulder like she'd just solved world peace. Meanwhile, I just nodded. I kept smiling while my stomach turned, because here's the thing they had no idea about. The house was already in my name. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just let the moment hang there while their laughter filled the room. It wasn't the first time they'd treated me like a placeholder for Simon, but this was different. This was public humiliation at its finest, and for a second, I considered saying something. But I didn't. Instead, I let them think they were winning. The tension in the room shifted after that. My mom kept making comments about how responsible Simon was and how I should learn from him, and my dad kept glancing at me like he expected me to protest or beg. Simon, of course, continued smirking, clearly enjoying the show. By dessert, I was quietly planning my next move. I couldn't let this go, not just because they were wrong about the house, but because their entire attitude was built on entitlement and manipulation. I needed to make them realize that the story they were telling themselves, about Simon being perfect and me being the annoying sibling, wasn't the truth. I finished my dessert quietly, letting everyone chatter around me. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the air, but I couldn't taste a thing. My mind was running 1,000 miles an hour. Every laugh from Simon, every congratulatory pat from my mom, every distracted glance from my dad felt like a tiny jab, reminding me that I was the lesser sibling in their eyes. After dinner, we all moved into the living room. My parents had strategically arranged the furniture so Simon's new workspace could be imagined in my old room. I caught them pointing subtly, as if I wasn't there, whispering about how nice it would be for Simon to finally have the space he deserves. "Do you like your room, Simon?" my mom asked, though it was more rhetorical than genuine. "It'll be perfect," Simon said with a grin, clearly expecting me to feel smaller, embarrassed. I sipped my water slowly, nodding like a good boy, but inside, I was already thinking 2 steps ahead. I had moved into this house a few years ago, not because they bought it for me, but because I had quietly saved and purchased it myself. They had always assumed that being parents meant owning the house gave them automatic control, but they didn't realize that the mortgage, the deeds, the legal papers, they were all in my name. They thought they could humiliate me tonight. They thought they could claim what wasn't theirs. And, honestly, I almost smiled at how foolish they were being. After a while, Simon excused himself, saying he wanted to check out the layout of the room. My parents didn't even blink. My mom whispered to my dad about rearranging furniture and colors, completely ignoring that I was sitting there like a statue, listening. Once Simon left, my mom turned to me with that familiar look, a mix of condescension and excitement, like she was about to lecture a child. You really should consider moving out soon, Harrison. It's only fair. Simon's worked so hard, and we wouldn't want him to feel cramped. You understand, don't you? I nodded slowly. Of course, I said, keeping my tone neutral. My parents were used to compliance, and I wanted them to underestimate me completely. Later, when Simon came back into the room, I noticed a small smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He thought he had already won, that the evening was wrapped up in his favor. That's when I realized something crucial. No one had actually asked me about moving. No one had consulted me or even considered my feelings. To them, I was a placeholder. And I decided right then, I would let them continue. Let them bask in the satisfaction of their imagined victory. I would let them laugh and pat Simon on the back. I would let them feel smug. But when the time came, they were going to be in for the shock of their lives. The night stretched on. Conversation drifted to Simon's new responsibilities, his bonuses, his office politics. My mom kept interjecting with subtle digs, comparing Simon's diligence to my lack of direction, and my dad nodded along, rarely contributing but always agreeing with her. I stayed silent. I didn't need to argue. Silence can be far more unsettling than any protest, and I was already picturing their reactions when the truth came out. At one point, my mom stood up, announcing that she had a surprise. I've arranged for Simon to have his own office set up in your room. Isn't that exciting? She said, directing the question to everyone except me. The room erupted in soft murmurs of approval. Simon beamed like a child opening a long-awaited gift. My dad clapped lightly, and my mom winked at him, clearly proud of herself for orchestrating this moment. I waited. I watched. I let them feel completely confident in their victory. I wanted to see every smug smile, every condescending gesture, every satisfied laugh. It was all fuel. Finally, when the conversation drifted to Simon's promotion party at work, I realized I had to move. It was time to plant the seed without giving anything away. Actually, I said casually, leaning back in my chair. Both my parents immediately looked at me, eyebrows raised, expecting compliance or hesitation. I'm glad you're all excited about Simon's new office. But there's something you might not realize about the house. My mom tilted her head, a slight frown forming. My dad straightened, suddenly attentive. Simon, naturally, looked confused. What do you mean? My mom asked, her tone carrying just a hint of suspicion. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reveal anything but promises revelation. The house is actually in my name. The entire house. The deed, the mortgage, all of it. Legally, it's mine. I've had it that way for a few years now. For a moment, there was stunned silence. My mom opened her mouth, probably to object, but no words came out. My dad's phone nearly slipped from his hand, and Simon's smug grin faltered, his eyes widening. I let the pause stretch. Let them imagine the reality. The room felt heavier, like the air itself was waiting for the reaction. Then my mom laughed. A high, sharp laugh, but it wasn't the approving, victorious kind. It was nervous, brittle, like she was trying to convince herself it was a joke. Well, Harrison, that's interesting, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Simon's jaw tightened. He muttered something under his breath about technicalities, and how is that even possible? But I ignored him. My dad's face went pale, and he finally spoke, his voice low and incredulous. This can't be right. You can't. I held up a hand. It's right. And it's been right for a while. So, if anyone thinks I'm moving out so Simon can have my room. I paused, letting my words sink in. They might want to think again. For a few seconds, no one spoke. I watched their expressions change, confusion, disbelief, panic bubbling beneath the surface. My mom's smile had completely vanished, replaced by something more like fury restrained by the need to maintain control. Simon's smirk was gone, replaced by raw irritation. My dad looked like he might combust at any second. And that's when I realized something crucial. I hadn't even begun to push back yet. They thought they were winning. They thought I was small, compliant, and easy to manipulate. But now they were realizing, piece by piece, that the entire foundation of their perceived control was crumbling. and the night was only just beginning. I leaned back, calm as ever, and waited. After I dropped the deed bomb, the room felt like it had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. My parents had always controlled the narrative in our household. They were the ones who decided who was right, who was deserving, and who was the problem. But now, for the first time, I held all the cards. The reality was slowly sinking in for them, but I could see the gears turning behind their eyes, calculating how to reclaim control, even though legally and practically they had none. My mom was the first to react. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her hands gripping her knees. "Harrison," she said, her tone trying to sound calm, "I don't understand. This is surely some kind of mistake. The house, this isn't what we agreed on." I tilted my head slightly, giving her the faintest smile. "We never really agreed on anything, Mom. You assumed you could control it because you were the parents. That's not how it works." She blinked rapidly, as if she were processing a reality that had never occurred to her before. "But Simon needs space. He has responsibilities now, and he's our son. We can't just ignore that." "You're not ignoring anything," I said smoothly. "Simon can have the office space he needs, sure, but it doesn't mean I have to give up my room or my house. This isn't a negotiation. It's already mine." Simon shifted in his chair. He had been smirking, trying to act unaffected, but now he looked like a cornered animal. "Harrison," he said quietly, "come on. You can't be serious. This is Mom and Dad's house. It's always been." "Legally," I interrupted, keeping my tone light and conversational, "it hasn't been. And that's the distinction you need to understand." My dad's face had gone pale, his usual smug composure evaporating into a rigid, strained expression. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally muttered, "This doesn't make sense. We paid for the house, Harrison." "We? You didn't," I said, leaning forward just slightly, not aggressive but deliberate. "I saved for it myself. Every payment, every fee, every little detail. You never actually owned it. You just assumed you did, because that's what you're used to, claiming ownership of anything you want. That stops here." My mom laughed again, but it wasn't the same brittle, nervous laugh from earlier. This one was sharp and a little louder, like she was trying to shock everyone into believing the absurdity wasn't real. "Harrison, this is ridiculous. You're trying to embarrass us, aren't you? This isn't the time to embarrass," I asked softly, letting the word hang in the air. "I'm just stating facts. You all seem to enjoy humiliating me at every turn, so maybe it's time someone told the truth. Simon doesn't get my room just because you decided it was convenient. I own this house. End of discussion." There was silence, a heavy, almost suffocating silence. My parents, who had always been quick to dominate any room, were suddenly unsure. Simon, who had never needed to work for anything besides praise, was visibly frustrated. I could see his hands clenching, his jaw tight, but he didn't dare argue further. That's when my mom tried to pivot. "Harrison, you're being so dramatic. It's just a room. Just your room. We're your family. Surely we can. Family doesn't get to make unilateral decisions like this," I said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "And if you think this is about a single room, you're wrong. This has been the pattern for years. Everything's always about Simon. Every achievement, every praise, every spotlight. I've been quiet about it for years, but tonight was just another example. And I won't let it happen again." She froze, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. My dad, still pale, tried to recover some ground. "Harrison, you know we just wanted." "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You wanted control. And control is what you had for too long. But that ends now." Simon scoffed under his breath, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "You're being ridiculous. Mom, Dad, he's acting like the house is some kind of game. This isn't funny." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I leaned back, calm, letting their frustration build. There's power in silence, especially when everyone expects you to panic or apologize. They had treated me like a pawn, like the quiet, compliant sibling, and now their own assumptions were turning against them. Then my mom spoke again, voice sharp, dangerously low. "You think this gives you power, Harrison? You think that because of some papers, you can humiliate us and Simon. But you forget, we are your parents. And no piece of paper will ever change that. I let the words sink in. They didn't realize yet that their idea of power had been a fragile illusion. I smiled slightly, almost imperceptibly. No one's humiliating anyone, I said. I'm simply clarifying reality. If you want to keep pretending I don't own this house, be my guest. But tonight, at least, the truth is out. For a moment, everyone looked frozen. I could see the internal panic in my mom's eyes, the frustrated indignation in Simon's, and my dad's desperate, flailing attempts to regain authority. And that's when I realized something crucial. The night wasn't just about me standing up. It was about watching them scramble in real time, realizing their entire perception of control was gone. I had to be patient. I had to let the tension grow. Every flinch, every muttered objection, every sharp intake of breath. This was all part of the stage. And I wasn't finished yet. I glanced at Simon, who was trying to regain his composure, clearly itching to storm out. But he didn't. He stayed. My mom's fingers drummed nervously on the armrest of the sofa. My dad was muttering under his breath, though I couldn't catch the words. I had them exactly where I wanted. And the next step, the one that would truly escalate this night, was coming. Because while they thought they had cornered me, they had no idea that the control I held wasn't just legal. It was strategic. And every smug smile, every laugh at my expense over the years, they were about to pay for it. I took a slow breath and smiled faintly. The room was tense. Too tense. And I could feel the moment approaching, the one where I would tip the entire balance of power in my favor. That's when my mom said it. The words that made my pulse quicken and my mind race with opportunity. "Fine," she said, her tone sharp, dangerous, and trembling all at once. "If you own the house, Harrison, then maybe we don't need to wait. Maybe we should just see how far you're willing to push it." I froze for just a second, reading her tone. This was it. This was the moment where the night could either explode or bend irrevocably in my favor. My instincts kicked in, and I realized that whatever I did next, whatever I said, would determine the next stage of this battle. I leaned back, calm as ever, letting them hang on the edge of uncertainty. And for the first time in years, I felt a thrill that wasn't fear. I was finally in control. After my mom's tremor of a threat, "Maybe we don't need to wait," the air in the living room condensed into something you could almost touch. It was sharp and bristling, like the moments just before a storm breaks. My heart was steady, oddly calm. I'd spent the last few years building toward this exact kind of quiet, surgical moment. Not a tantrum, not a public spectacle, but a dismantling so precise it would leave them exposed and scrambling. The way predators panic when suddenly they're the ones in a trap. I let them stew. For a long time, they've been the architects of the narrative. Simon the flawless son, me the agreeable shadow. I'd accepted the role when I was younger because I thought it kept the peace. But peace was just another word they used to dress up dominance. Tonight, I wasn't interested in peace. I wanted consequences, smart, irreversible, and utterly humiliating for anyone who had treated me like a doormat. "Why don't we go see Simon's new office layout?" my mom suggested, trying to steer the group away from the awkwardness. It was an obvious attempt to put the evening back on rails. My parents had always been good at steering. They had practiced controlling rooms the way some people practiced a golf swing. But control requires two things: momentum and belief. Both had just been taken from them. Simon hopped up, eager to escape the shifting attention, and went to fetch a flashlight. My dad hung back for a second as if considering an exit route, but then he followed, because leaving would mean admitting defeat in front of Simon, and neither of them were willing to swallow that yet. When the three of them stood in the narrow hallway, whispering about rugs and lamps, I stood up too. I walked past them and into the room they assumed had been earmarked for Simon's triumph. It felt strange and delicious to cross that threshold with an inward smile. The carpet had been vacuumed that afternoon, my mom's idea of presentation, and the angle of the lamp was just so, but the room was still mine in ways they could not grasp. The paint on the walls, the framed prints, the bookshelf with my carefully arranged business ledgers, and a chipped coffee mug. My life was folded into that room. They had treated it like a prop. I opened the closet and pulled out the small accordion folder I'd kept since I bought the house. It wasn't flashy, no embossed leather or theatrical flourish, just a simple gray folder labeled House Papers in my handwriting. Inside were the deed copies, mortgage statements, receipts from contractors I'd paid directly, and the kind of dry, bureaucratic paperwork that can silence entitlement faster than any argument. I left them in the folder like evidence on an investigator's table. Then I did something they wouldn't expect. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and hit record. Not to capture their faces, though that was part of it, but to capture the sound of them. Over the last few months, on impulse, and because I wanted proof for myself, I had recorded several conversations. Not the invasive kind you see in thrillers, no midnight surveillance, no stalking, but small, candid bits. My mom laughing about me, being reasonable again, Simon casually mocking my business as a hobby, my dad whispering about keeping things straightforward. Each clip was a stitch in a pattern I'd lived in for years. Tonight felt like the evening to explain the pattern out loud. I stepped back into the living room where they waited, murmuring, the way a jury murmurs in the gaps of a trial. My mom's face had hardened into a mask. Simon looked restless. My dad's hands twitched, an old habit when he was about to try to lie his way into authority. Before we start talking about furniture, I said calmly, there are a few things I think we should make absolutely clear. My mom's eyes narrowed. Harrison, just listen, I cut in. Please. It was so unlike me to cut her off. I watched that tiny flinch of surprise roll across her features. It was addictive. I sat down in the middle of the room, folded the folder on my lap, and placed my phone on the coffee table between us. I hit play. The first clip was small, hardly more than a minute. My mom's voice, bright and conspiratorial, at brunch a month ago. We'll nudge him a bit, she was saying. He's so easy. He'll move when the time comes. The camera caught Simon's chuckle, easy, dismissive. It's only fair, he added. Who even uses that room? Harrison can get by somewhere else. The sounds in the room changed. My dad's throat cleared, a tiny mechanical sound. My mom's hands went cold against her knees. Simon's mouth tightened. The clip ended, but the echo of it settled in the air like dust. I played another. This one was from a smaller argument I'd overheard while making tea 2 weeks ago. My dad saying, we did a lot for him. College, support, everything. This house has always been an investment for the family. My mom replied, softer, right, but he should know his place. The recording was clinical in its cruelty, the tone casual enough to be normal within their bubble. One by one, I let the recordings stitch a portrait. Not one scandalous confession, but 100 small cruelties, an accumulation of entitlement and condescension. Each clip was mundane, which made them worse, more believable, more damning. It was the difference between a single punch and a life of bruises. They had been hitting me with the latter for decades. When the last clip ended, the room felt colder. My mom's jaw worked. Simon looked like he might leave, but his feet were rooted. My dad's face was a map of surprise, then anger, then something that looked dangerously like fear. Do you hear it now? I asked softly. Do you hear how easily you decide things that affect other people? Do you hear how it all sounds when you're not trying to dress it up? My mom's voice came out small. Harrison, you shouldn't. This is private. She tried to rise to indignation, but it didn't hold. Private, in their vocabulary, had always mean what they wanted it to mean. Secrets they kept to preserve image. To me, private meant the truth they'd hidden. It's not about privacy, I said. It's about consequences. You've built a life where your word is law. You shame, you laugh, you decide. I let you do that because I thought I could keep things smooth. But smoothness for you has always been control. Simon finally found his voice, brittle. What do you want, Harrison? To make us look bad? To play martyr? I smiled, not cruelly, but with a calm that made his face crack. I don't want to play anything. I want correction. I want respect. I also want fairness. You asked me to move out tonight like it was a courtesy. You treated me like I was a cardboard cutout. I'm done aligning those expectations for you. Then what? What are you going to do? My dad's question sounded small and helpless, which almost made me pity him. Almost. I reached into the folder, and slid a thick envelope across the coffee table. His fingers hovered over it like an animal considering bait. Inside was a letter from my solicitor confirming the deed, a formal notice that, because the house was registered to me, I had every right to control access and residency. I had discussed several options with my lawyer: formal rental agreements, house rules, changes to access permissions. I hadn't needed to execute them yet. I hadn't intended to, not tonight. But the letter made it tangible. You will need to sign a residency agreement, I said. If you want to continue living here, if you want Simon to have a room, we'll do it properly. Fair market rates. Security deposit. Clear terms. I let each word land like a metronome, precise and measured. My mom's hand flew to her mouth. The color had left her face. You can't be serious, she whispered. We're your parents. You are my family, I corrected. That's different from ownership. Simon's laugh was a staccato, angry sound. You're extorting us. You'll make money off your own family. It's not extortion, I said. It's accountability. You've treated this place like it was a buffet. Time to start paying for your plate. They all began talking at once. My dad trying to reason, my mom pleading, Simon sputtering threats thin with bravado. I watched their panic rise in that familiar wave pattern they always used when they felt cornered. It fed something cold and steady in me, the knowledge that entitlement, when pried open, reveals fear. Then I added the part that I knew would turn their scramble into a full-blown spiral, the move that would split the night between before and after. I've also made a couple of practical changes, I said, calm as a man announcing the weather. I've updated the account holders on the utility accounts, and I changed the garage keypad code this morning. If anyone needs access to anything after tonight, they'll need my approval. The room went completely quiet. My mom's mouth formed an O. Simon's face went pale as if someone had drained all the color out of him. My dad's bluff faltered. In that silence, the reality sank in. The rituals they had relied on, coming and going, deciding, claiming, were no longer automatic. My mother's voice, when it came, was granular with fury and something close to grief. You can't do that, Harrison. You're cruel. She flailed for words, which only made her sound more exposed. I can and I did, I said. I can also put the house on the market if that's what it takes. I can enforce the rules any way I need to. I can make it uncomfortable until you understand what it means to assume someone else's life is yours. They looked at me the way people look at a sudden cliff. Disbelief, then calculation. I had given them two things that would sting: proof and consequence. Proof had stripped away their plausible deniability. Consequence would cost them something tender, their assumptions and, potentially, their comfort. My mom's voice was strangled now. You're hurting us. It was a carefully fashioned accusation, meant to reverse roles. I felt something like pity for her then, but it was quickly buried under the cold practicality of what needed to happen. You hurt me for years, I answered. Different scale, same action. The moment had stretched long enough to form a clear line. On one side, a house that had been a stage for their self-congratulation. On the other, a house that belonged to me, now a tool for setting boundaries. What came next would decide whether they found a way to own their behavior or whether they dug in deeper, transforming humiliation into vengeance. They were all waiting for the next move: anger, excuse, apology, or outright rebellion. I had one more play, one more thing I'd prepared that would either force them to bend or shatter them completely. My finger hovered over the phone, where one last recording sat, the one I'd been saving for the perfect moment. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply undeniable. I let the last clip play. This one was simple and small and poisonous in its ordinariness. It was a voice memo I'd taken months ago when I'd overheard my parents talking in the kitchen about how easy it would be if Harrison left, and practically listing the steps they'd take. My mom, voice breezy and tired, said, "We'll just push him. Make it seem normal. He'll get flattered. He'll move for something. Travel, a job, anything." My dad laughed softly in the background and said, "We'll just make it look like it's for Simon. The papers are confusing for him. He won't fight." Simon's chuckle cut through. Cruel, pleased, the sound of someone enjoying the idea of someone else's discomfort. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was simply the plan, stated like a household chore. Their faces changed as the audio filled the room. The smugness drained. My mom's hands trembled. My dad's face went slack as if someone had taken the air out of him. Simon's jaw worked until his teeth clicked. "You heard it," I said quietly. "You hear how casual you were about making decisions about my life. You knew what you were doing." My mom tried to speak, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Harrison, this was family talk." "Family talk," I echoed. "You call plotting how to push your son out family talk?" I let the question hang so long it grew heavy. "It's clear what you meant. You didn't intend to ask me. You intended to move me like a piece on a board." My dad sputtered that they'd only ever done what they thought was best, that Simon needed space, that it was for the family. I let him say it. He needed to say it out loud, and he needed to hear himself sound shallow when he did. My mom moved to take my hand, to plead the word sorry, but I pulled away gently. Her apology would have been a bomb only if her actions matched it. They didn't. "I called my lawyer before dinner," I said. "I didn't call to threaten. I called to get clarity, because this house isn't a blank piece of paper for you to doodle on. He drew up a residency agreement last month, terms in writing. I have the notice here." I pushed the envelope across the table again, so the paper slid like a dare. There was a rustle as my dad read. The residency agreement was precise and unforgiving. Market rate rent, a security deposit, obligations for utilities and upkeep, and a clause that any breach could result in immediate termination of residency. It was legal, yes, but it was also an ethical ledger. They'd been living in the assumption that family gave them rights without responsibilities. The paper required both. "You can sign," I said, "or you can leave. Either way, I'm not moving. I won't be treated like a tenant who pays for your conveniences with silence." They stared. The humiliation arrived in slow, hot waves. My mother's fingers dug into the armrest. Simon bailed with questions about how I could be so cold, how I could play lawyer in my own home. My dad sputtered. What followed was a feverish, ridiculous attempt at damage control. Promises to be better, declarations of need, pleas about health and memories and what-ifs. They tried to frame their years of entitlement as love. It didn't land. I'd listened to them undermine me for the better part of my life. Apologies that arrived in the heat of being caught mattered less than the work of change, and I had no reason to trust them. We didn't escalate into shouting. That wasn't my style, and it wouldn't be effective. Instead, I made choices that were surgical and immovable. First, the practical stuff. I'd already changed the garage keypad code that morning and updated the major utility accounts. Those weren't threats. They were measures to make sure that if they refused to negotiate in good faith, I had the legal and physical control to enforce the boundary. When my mother moved toward the hallway to grab her coat in a trembling attempt at theatrics, "We'll leave, Harrison. We'll go." I stopped her by saying calmly, "If you want to leave tonight, fine. You can take what fits in your car. I'll give you 30 days for anything else." She looked like someone offered a thin slice of mercy and then realized how expensive it was. Then I made the call, not to humiliate, but to formalize what I'd offered verbally. I phoned the solicitor right there in the living room. The conversation was short. The lawyer confirmed that, yes, because the house was in my name and I'd updated account holders and security, I had the right to determine residency terms. He agreed to prepare a certified notice to be delivered if my parents refused to sign within the next week. I let him say the things professionals say, sober, bureaucratic phrases that carry weight. It felt oddly satisfying hearing the language of consequence laid over years of emotional disrepair. They wrestled with the decision quietly. My mother cried. My father tried to bargain. Simon called me every name he could think of in half a sentence and then collapsed into bitter silence. In the end, they didn't sign that night. They left, not with dignity, but with the clumsy dignity of people who had been dislodged and were trying to gather themselves in the parking lot like a child who's lost a toy. They moved into an apartment 2 weeks later. Not because I demanded it, though I had left the formal options on the table, but because they chose to walk away rather than stare their entitlement down and change. Simon stayed with them for a little while until his new job responsibilities made him take a place closer to work. He called me a few times, furious, then awkward, then accusing, but he never came back to the house as a resident. My parents tried to reach out for reconciliations early on. Cards, awkward dinners I didn't attend, messages with strings of "we're sorry" and maybe calls. I didn't respond. The silence was deliberate. I had given them the choice to repair the harm. They chose to preserve their self-image instead. As for me, I changed the locks professionally, updated the security system to my own account, and made the residency agreement into a template for a future where boundaries mattered. I rented the spare room to a colleague I trusted, someone who paid their rent on time and respected shared spaces. The house felt different, lighter, honest, a place that reflected my life rather than their assumed entitlement. I kept the framed prints, my business ledgers, the chipped coffee mug. Some things weren't about punishment. They were about continuity. The fallout was messy and small and somehow final. My parents' social circle had to decide whether to align with them or with reality. Some chose them. A few others, people who'd seen the pattern, didn't. The neighborhood gossip was a sting, but only for a little while. People talk about family drama like it's a sport. They forget the damage it does. I didn't care about the whispers. I cared about what I owned, literally and emotionally. In the months that followed, my parents adjusted to smaller lives. I found out through mutual relatives that my mother had begun volunteering at a community center, perhaps searching for the good-sounding work that might repair an image. My father began to spend afternoons at the local cafe, telling anyone who would listen that things had been misunderstood. Simon's career advanced, with the same confidence he'd always had, but his circle felt different. People are kinder to a person who seems untouchable. Simon had become more reachable in a way that suited me just fine. I didn't forgive them. Forgiveness felt like a currency they might spend to absolve themselves without real change. I withheld it. Instead, I created distance rich with consequence. I made sure that any future contact would be on my terms. Say the words, show the work, and perhaps someday we'd speak again. Until then, I would manage the house with rules, with clarity, and with a patience that is not mercy. Mercy is easy when you still have the power to demand accountability. At the end of it, they were still my parents, but they were also the architects of their own unraveling. They are, to friends and relatives, the same people, polished, persuasive, and often convincing, but in the private ledger of my life, they lost the right to decide for me. I didn't relish their fall. I didn't dance on it. Revenge, for me, wasn't fireworks or cruelty. It was a deliberate reclaiming of life, of space, of dignity. It was ensuring that the people who had treated me like a placeholder could no longer use my home as a stage for their entitlements. I sleep well now. The house is mine, and in the quiet of the mornings, with sunlight on the living room rug and the sound of a neighbor's radio drifting faintly through the walls, I feel it. Calm, hard-won, and absolute. They are villains in my story, not because I crafted them that way for drama, but because their actions for years were small, repeated cruelties disguised as family. I won't forgive what I haven't seen changed. For now, that is the consequence they live with, and it will have to be enough. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.